Deep in the rugged mountains of Arizona, where the desert wind carries secrets from centuries past, a man named Jake Morrison made what seemed like the deal of a lifetime. For just $5 at a county foreclosure auction, he purchased an abandoned cabin that had sat empty for decades. Little did he know that this seemingly innocent transaction would thrust him into a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about history, survival, and the human spirit. The cabin sat perched on a rocky outcrop 30 miles northeast of Flagstaff, accessible only by a winding dirt road that most locals avoided after dark. Jake, a freelance writer from Phoenix who specialized in restoration projects, saw potential where others saw decay. The structure itself was modest, built from weathered pine logs with a stone chimney that had partially collapsed. What drew him to the property wasn't its condition, but its isolation and the stories the realtor claimed surrounded it. According to local folklore, the cabin had been built in 1887 by a prospector named Elias Whitman who disappeared without a trace 3 months after completing construction. Over the decades, several families had attempted to make it their home, but none stayed longer than a year. The most recent owners, the Hendricks family, had fled in 1993 claiming they heard voices in the walls and found evidence that someone else was living in the cabin alongside them. Jake dismissed these tales as small-town superstition designed to drive down the property value. He was a practical man who believed in logical explanations and hard work. His plan was simple: spend the summer renovating the cabin, document the process for a series of articles about DIY restoration, and then either sell it for a profit or use it as a weekend retreat. On a scorching Thursday morning in June, Jake arrived at the property with his pickup truck loaded with tools, supplies, and enough provisions for a week of preliminary work. The cabin looked even more dilapidated than he remembered from his initial visit. Thick vines had claimed the eastern wall, the front porch sagged dangerously to one side, and several windows were either cracked or missing entirely. But beneath the neglect, Jake could see the solid craftsmanship of the original construction. He spent the first day clearing debris and assessing the structural integrity of the building. The main room was larger than it appeared from outside, with hand-hewn beams supporting a loft area that had once served as a bedroom. A massive stone fireplace dominated the western wall, and Jake noted with satisfaction that the chimney, while damaged, could be repaired without too much difficulty. As he worked, Jake became aware of an unusual acoustic quality to the cabin. Sounds seemed to echo longer than they should, and occasionally he caught what sounded like whispers when the wind picked up. He attributed this to the way air moved through the various cracks and gaps in the structure, making a mental note to address the insulation issues once he began serious renovations. On his second day at the property, while prying up damaged floorboards in the main room, Jake made his first significant discovery. Beneath a section of planking near the fireplace, he found a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. The preservation was remarkable, and as he carefully opened the brittle pages, he realized he was looking at the personal writings of Elias Whitman himself. The journal entries began optimistically, documenting Whitman's daily progress on the cabin and his hopes of striking it rich in the nearby hills. But as Jake read deeper, the tone shifted dramatically. Whitman wrote of strange sounds in the night, of finding his supplies mysteriously rearranged each morning, and of an overwhelming sense that he was being watched. The final entry, dated September 15, 1887, was barely legible and spoke of shadows moving in broad daylight and voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. But it was here that Jake encountered his first hook, a detail that would change everything he thought he knew about this place. Whitman's final entry mentioned discovering 7 women hiding in a space beneath his cabin. Women he described as Apache, who seemed to materialize from nowhere, and who communicated with him through gestures and broken English. According to the journal, these women were not hostile but appeared to be hiding from something or someone that terrified them more than a lone white prospector. Jake set the journal aside and began a more thorough examination of the cabin's floor. Using his flashlight and a crowbar, he discovered that several floorboards near the back wall were not nailed down but rather rested on a system of hidden hinges. When he lifted these boards, he revealed a narrow opening that led to what appeared to be a natural cave system beneath the cabin. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and Jake could feel cool air rising from the darkness below. His practical mind told him to proceed with caution, to perhaps return with proper lighting and safety equipment. But his curiosity proved stronger than his prudence, and using his smartphone's flashlight, he lowered himself through the opening into the space below. What Jake found defied his expectations entirely. The natural cave had been modified and expanded, creating a series of interconnected chambers that extended far beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The walls showed evidence of careful stonework, and he could see that someone had gone to great lengths to make this underground space livable. There were carved shelves, areas that had clearly been used for sleeping, and even a sophisticated system for collecting and storing water from an underground spring. But most shocking of all were the clear signs that this underground refuge had been occupied recently, far more recently than the 1880s. Jake found modern items scattered throughout the chambers. Plastic water bottles, canned goods with expiration dates from the 1990s, and clothing that was definitely not from the Victorian era. Someone had been living in this space, and based on the evidence, they had been there as recently as a few years ago. As Jake explored deeper into the cave system, his flashlight began to dim, and he realized he should return to the surface before he became completely lost in the darkness. But as he made his way back toward the opening, he heard something that made his blood run cold. From somewhere in the depths of the cave system came the unmistakable sound of human voices, speaking in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language he couldn't identify. Jake froze, listening intently, but the voices faded as quickly as they had appeared. His rational mind suggested it might have been an echo of his own movements, or perhaps sound traveling from the surface above. But something deep in his instincts told him otherwise. Someone else was down here with him, someone who was trying very hard not to be discovered. Fighting the urge to call out, Jake quietly made his way back to the opening and pulled himself up into the cabin. His hands were shaking as he replaced the floorboards, and he found himself constantly glancing at the area where he knew the entrance lay hidden. The afternoon sun streaming through the cabin's windows seemed almost blindingly bright after the darkness below, and Jake had to sit for several minutes before his eyes adjusted. That night, camping in his truck outside the cabin, Jake pored over Whitman's journal by lamplight. The prospector's descriptions of the 7 Apache women became more detailed in later entries, and Jake began to piece together a story that was both fascinating and deeply troubling. According to Whitman, the women had told him through gestures and simple words that they were hiding from soldiers who had destroyed their village and killed their families. They were the sole survivors of what appeared to have been a massacre, and they had taken refuge in the cave system to avoid capture. Whitman wrote that he had provided them with supplies and had promised to keep their presence secret. But the final entries suggested that something had gone wrong. The prospector wrote of increasing paranoia, of fears that he was being watched not just by the hidden Apache women but by others who might be searching for them. His last coherent entry spoke of plans to leave the cabin and head west to California, abandoning his mining claims to escape what he described as an impossible situation. Jake realized that if Whitman's journal was accurate, he had stumbled upon evidence of a historical atrocity that had been covered up for over a century. But the modern items he had found in the cave suggested that the story was far from over. Someone had been using that underground refuge in recent years, and the voices he had heard suggested they might still be there. The next morning brought Jake his second hook, a discovery that would transform his understanding of the situation entirely. As he prepared to descend into the cave system again, this time with proper lighting and safety equipment, he noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. The prints were small, clearly made by women's shoes, and they led from the tree line to the cabin and then seemed to disappear at the front door. Jake examined the prints carefully and realized they couldn't be more than a day or two old. Someone had been watching his campsite, had approached his cabin while he slept, and had somehow entered the building without him hearing anything. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. If there really were people living in the cave system below, they were clearly aware of his presence and had been observing him. This time, when Jake descended into the cave system, he was better prepared. He carried multiple flashlights, a first aid kit, and enough supplies to last several hours underground. He also brought a voice recorder, hoping to document whatever he might discover in the depths below the cabin. The cave system was even more extensive than he had initially realized. Following what appeared to be the main passage, Jake discovered that the chambers extended deep into the hillside, with some areas opening into natural caverns large enough to hold dozens of people. The stonework was more sophisticated than he had first noticed, with carefully constructed drainage systems and ventilation shafts that connected to the surface at strategic points. In one of the deeper chambers, Jake made a discovery that left him speechless. Carved into the stone wall was a series of petroglyphs that appeared to be a mixture of traditional Apache symbols and more modern additions. Some of the carvings were clearly ancient, but others showed evidence of recent work. Most intriguingly, there were dates carved into the stone, ranging from 1887 all the way up to 2019. Below the petroglyphs, Jake found what appeared to be a shrine or memorial. Arranged on natural stone shelves were personal items that spanned more than a century, jewelry that appeared to be traditional Apache craftswork, photographs of Native American families from various decades, and modern items like cell phones and identification documents. It was as if this place had served as a refuge for multiple generations of people, all connected by some shared tragedy or purpose. As Jake documented his findings with his camera, he became aware that he was no longer alone in the chamber. The acoustics of the space made it difficult to pinpoint the source, but he could clearly hear the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. Someone was watching him from the shadows, and they were close enough that he could hear their respiration echoing off the stone walls. Jake turned slowly, sweeping his flashlight beam across the chamber, but saw no one. The breathing seemed to come from multiple directions, suggesting that more than one person was present. His heart pounded as he realized that he was surrounded by invisible watchers who could see him clearly while he remained blind to their presence. Fighting his instinct to flee, Jake decided to try communication. Speaking in a clear, calm voice, he addressed the darkness around him. He explained who he was, why he had come to the cabin, and that he meant no harm to anyone who might be living in the cave system. He mentioned Whitman's journal and his desire to understand the history of the place, hoping that his genuine curiosity might overcome any fear or hostility his presence had created. For several long minutes, there was no response except the echo of his own voice. But gradually, Jake became aware of movement in the shadows at the edge of his flashlight beam. Shapes that might have been rocks seemed to shift and flow, and he realized that people were emerging from hiding places so well concealed that he would never have spotted them without their cooperation. The first woman to step into his light was elderly, with long gray hair braided with leather and beads. Her face was weathered by years of outdoor living, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She wore a mixture of traditional and modern clothing, a denim jacket over what appeared to be a hand-woven shirt, and sturdy hiking boots that had clearly seen extensive use. Behind her, 6 other women emerged from the shadows, ranging in age from what appeared to be their 20s to their 60s. Jake's first instinct was to reach for his phone to document this extraordinary encounter, but something in the eldest woman's expression stopped him. She held up a hand in a gesture that was clearly a warning, and Jake slowly lowered his camera. The message was clear. This meeting was happening on their terms, and any attempt to record or exploit the situation would end the interaction immediately. The eldest woman spoke first, her English accented but clear. She introduced herself as Maria Santos, though she explained that this was not her birth name. The other women, she said, were her daughters, nieces, and granddaughters, all of whom had found refuge in this underground sanctuary over the years. They were not all Apache, Maria explained, but rather a collection of Native American women from various tribes who had been displaced, threatened, or abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. Maria's story unfolded like layers of an onion, each revelation more shocking than the last. The cave system, she explained, had been used as a hiding place for over a century, passed down through a network of Native American women who had nowhere else to turn. Some had fled domestic violence on reservations where local authorities refused to intervene. Others had escaped human trafficking operations that preyed on vulnerable Native women. Still others were hiding from family members or community leaders who had threatened them for speaking out about abuse or corruption. The 7 women currently living in the caves represented 3 generations of this hidden sisterhood. The youngest, Maria's great-niece Sarah, was only 19 and had arrived just 6 months earlier after escaping what Maria described as a marriage arranged by her family to settle gambling debts. The oldest, besides Maria herself, was a woman named Elena who had been living underground for nearly 30 years after witnessing the murder of her sister by an abusive boyfriend who had never been prosecuted. Each woman had her own story of betrayal by systems that should have protected them, of authorities who ignored their pleas for help, and of communities that blamed them for the violence perpetrated against them. The cave system had become their sanctuary, a place where they could live safely while maintaining some connection to the outside world through carefully planned supply runs and occasional contact with sympathetic outsiders who helped them obtain necessities. Jake listened in growing amazement as Maria explained the sophisticated survival system they had developed. The underground spring provided fresh water, and they had learned to grow certain crops in chambers where sunlight filtered down through carefully concealed openings. They had established relationships with several people in nearby towns who provided supplies and information in exchange for handmade crafts and other goods the women produced in their hidden workshops. The revelation that shocked Jake most was Maria's explanation of how they had managed to remain hidden for so long. The cave system, she explained, was far more extensive than what he had seen. There were multiple entrances scattered across several square miles of wilderness, most of them so well concealed that even experienced hikers walked past them without noticing. The women had spent decades mapping and improving these passages, creating what amounted to an underground city that could house dozens of people if necessary. But their sanctuary was under threat, Maria explained, and Jake's arrival represented both an opportunity and a danger. Recent changes in land ownership in the area had brought new attention to previously ignored parcels, and there were rumors that the state was planning to conduct geological surveys that might reveal the cave system's existence. If their hiding place were discovered by the wrong people, the consequences could be catastrophic for all the women who depended on it for survival. This was where Jake's purchase of the cabin became crucial to their situation. As the legal owner of the surface property, he had rights that could potentially protect the cave system below. But they needed to trust that he wouldn't betray their location or exploit their vulnerability for personal gain. The decision to reveal themselves to him, Maria explained, had been debated for days after they first detected his presence. Jake found himself facing a moral dilemma unlike anything he had ever encountered. These women were asking him to become complicit in their concealment, to help them maintain a secret that could potentially last for generations. But they were also asking him to protect people who had been failed by every other system designed to ensure their safety and well-being. As he learned more about each woman's individual circumstances, Jake began to understand the complexity of their situation. Sarah, the youngest, had family members who were actively searching for her and who had resources and connections that made traditional safe houses inadequate protection. Elena had witnessed crimes that implicated powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to maintain their silence. Two of the middle-aged women, sisters named Carmen and Rosa, were hiding from an organized crime network that had been trafficking Native American women across state lines for years. The more Jake learned, the more he realized that these women weren't simply hiding from individual threats. They were protecting themselves from systemic failures that stretched across multiple institutions and jurisdictions. Local law enforcement, federal agencies, tribal authorities, and social service organizations had all, in various ways, failed to protect them when they needed help most. But the story took another dramatic turn when Maria revealed the most closely guarded secret of their underground community. The cave system didn't just house the 7 women currently living there. It also contained extensive documentation of the network of violence and corruption that had driven them into hiding. Over the decades, the women had collected evidence, recorded testimonies, and documented patterns of abuse that stretched across the entire region. What they had assembled, Maria explained, was nothing short of a comprehensive expose of institutional failures that had allowed violence against Native American women to continue unchecked for generations. They had names, dates, photographs, and recorded conversations that implicated law enforcement officers, judges, social workers, and community leaders in a web of corruption and complicity that would shock anyone who believed in the integrity of the justice system. The documentation was hidden in a specially constructed chamber deeper in the cave system, protected from moisture and temperature fluctuations by techniques the women had developed over years of trial and error. Maria led Jake to this chamber, where he saw filing cabinets, storage boxes, and computer equipment that represented decades of careful documentation and preservation work. But here was where the story took its most dramatic turn. The women weren't simply collecting this evidence for historical purposes. They were preparing to release it in a coordinated effort that would expose the entire network of corruption and force a reckoning that had been decades in the making. Jake's arrival at the cabin, they believed, might be the final piece they needed to make their plan work. As a professional writer with established contacts in journalism and publishing, Jake represented an opportunity to get their story out to a wider audience in a way that couldn't be suppressed or ignored. But they needed someone they could trust completely, someone who understood the stakes involved and who wouldn't be intimidated by the powerful people their revelations would implicate. The decision facing Jake was enormous. If he agreed to help them, he would be committing himself to a course of action that would likely consume months or years of his life and could potentially put him in significant danger. The people these women were preparing to expose had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their secrets, and Jake had no illusions about what might happen if he became too visible a threat to their interests. But if he walked away, he would be abandoning 7 women who had trusted him with their deepest secrets and who had no other viable options for getting their story told. More broadly, he would be allowing a system of violence and corruption to continue operating unchecked, knowing that other women would suffer as a result of his inaction. As Jake wrestled with this decision, Maria shared one final revelation that sealed his commitment to their cause. Among the evidence they had collected was documentation of the original massacre that had driven the first Apache women into the cave system in 1887. What Whitman had witnessed and documented in his journal was not an isolated incident but part of a systematic campaign to eliminate Native American presence in the region through violence and intimidation. The same families and institutions that had perpetrated those original crimes, Maria explained, were still in positions of power in the region. The corruption and violence that had driven women into hiding in recent decades was directly connected to the historical atrocities that had started the cycle more than a century earlier. Breaking this cycle would require not just exposing current crimes but revealing their historical roots and the continuity of institutional complicity that had allowed them to persist. Jake realized that he wasn't just being asked to help 7 individual women. He was being invited to participate in a reckoning with more than a century of systematic injustice, to help bring to light truths that powerful people had spent generations keeping hidden. The weight of that responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the opportunity to make a difference in a way that few people ever get the chance to do. His decision made, Jake spent the next several weeks working with the women to develop a comprehensive plan for revealing their evidence and telling their stories. The approach they settled on was multifaceted, involving simultaneous releases to multiple news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and advocacy groups to prevent any single entity from suppressing or limiting the impact of their revelations. The process of preparing the materials for release was exhausting and emotionally draining. Jake found himself documenting stories of violence and betrayal that were difficult to hear and even more difficult to verify and present in a way that would be credible to skeptical audiences. But the women's courage in sharing their experiences gave him strength to continue, and their meticulous documentation made his job as a writer much easier than it might otherwise have been. As word of their project began to spread through carefully selected networks of journalists and advocates, Jake and the women realized they were creating something unprecedented. Never before had such a comprehensive documentation of systematic violence against Native American women been assembled and prepared for public release. The implications were staggering, and the potential for real change was enormous. But so were the risks. As they moved closer to their planned revelation date, signs began to accumulate that their activities had attracted unwanted attention. Jake noticed vehicles parked along the access road to the cabin that hadn't been there before. The women reported unusual activity around some of their other entrance points. And Maria received word through her network that people were asking questions about the cave system and whether anyone might be living there. The final weeks before their planned announcement were tense with anticipation and fear. Jake found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, and the women increased their security precautions to levels they hadn't needed in years. Everyone understood that they were approaching a point of no return, after which their lives would be forever changed regardless of how their revelations were received. But they also understood that they had reached a moment when the choice was no longer between safety and danger, but between different types of risk. Staying hidden might preserve their immediate security, but it would also ensure that the system of violence and corruption they had documented would continue to operate unchecked. Speaking out would certainly bring danger, but it also offered the possibility of real change and justice for countless other women who had no voice of their own. When the moment finally came to release their evidence to the world, Jake felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration unlike anything he had ever experienced. Standing in the main chamber of the cave system, surrounded by 7 remarkable women who had trusted him with their deepest secrets, he realized that his $5 investment in an abandoned cabin had led him to the most important work of his life. The response to their revelations was everything they had hoped for and more. News organizations across the country picked up the story, law enforcement agencies launched investigations, and advocacy groups rallied to support the women's courage in speaking out. But perhaps most importantly, other women began to come forward with their own stories, adding their voices to a chorus that became impossible to ignore. The 7 women who had hidden in the cave system for so long found themselves transformed from invisible victims into powerful advocates for change. Their underground sanctuary, once a place of hiding and fear, became a symbol of resistance and hope for Native American women across the country. And Jake discovered that sometimes the most important purchases in life have nothing to do with money and everything to do with the courage to act on what you discover in the darkness.